Hey everybody, P.D. Turner, executive producer and host of the Break It Down show. I thought I would jump in. Will's going to be in here in a second, but I don't want to make you wait any longer. So what we're working on today is Dr. Wilfred Reilly and I wrote a little book. We didn't write a book. We wrote a chapter in a book. Okay, so this is the Challenge to NATO, and it's a conference that Troy University, that's actually where Rich works. They put on this conference talking about NATO and its role internationally and where we're going and what we're headed, and with Russia and the Ukraine still locking horns, it's NATO is as relevant today as it was 70 years ago. So this book is an edited volume with a whole bunch of chapters in it, and our chapter is one of the leading chapters. We've had a couple people from this event on the show. We had most notably probably Ambassador Dr. Robert Hunter, who's worked with basically every presidential administration since the Johnson administration in the early to mid 60s. The thing with this article is there's all kinds of things that NATO does. They do peacekeeping missions, they do stability operations. They also ball their fist and do the whole we're coming after you. You got to calm the hell down. And whoever's coming after Europe, if you're a NATO nation, it's good to know that you got a bunch of countries allied together and working on this problem. So we, Rich and I wrote from the point of a lot of the U.S. Things in the modern war sense, operations like in Iraq, operations in Afghanistan. These things are not NATO missions, but they're also not NATO missions. It just depends on locality. So there was some UN aspects of what we were doing, but there are also coalition forces. And since we deploy as a coalition when we're NATO, since we deploy as a coalition when we're UN and the US, we thought it appropriate to write about how we can leverage religion to our advantage and try to get things done more effectively. Because what we had normally do with religion, this is why I wanted to write this article. This is the down and dirty part. We're always briefed that religion is scary, the separation of church and state. But the reality is most of the world, religion is a big part of the state. And in the two places we went to, Afghanistan and Iraq, Iraq has the words Allah Akbar on the flag. That's pretty religious, and it's on their flag. And then the government of Afghanistan was the Islamic Republic. And so you have this thing where you have an Islamic Republic. You have this sectarian, at least what they called sectarian violence, and religion being such a big part of that fight. When we're told, don't go into a mosque, don't discuss religion, and all, it's the wrong way to approach these problems. Because when you go out into the villages, when you talk to the different leaders and elders, they're using religion as a lens to see things. Whether they're religious or not, it's part of culture. Right now, we're in the Christmas season. That's a religious thing. You may not be religious, but we have this holiday that's tied to the Christian faith. So that was the whole point of the paper. I'm going to check in here and see if Will's coming. Let's see here. All right. I'll send him a text. We'll hopefully hear from him in a moment here. Yeah, so the paper is about 20 pages long, and there's a lot of text in there that's really powerful. One of the things that we discuss is state building. Hey, Jenny Moore, how are you? State building versus nation building. And state building is really what we were trying to do there. And you can't have a state if you don't have belief in the state. The state can't deliver services and defense to the people. It gets awfully hard. Here comes Will. Well, that must be Will Reilly right there.
Sure is. How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I just kind of vamping while you were chiming in. I'm gonna let you do it. I'm just gonna kick the show off as soon as you're ready, and then I'm gonna throw it back over to you. And Rich may join us. I'm not sure he's trying to, but the schedule thing got crazy for him.
Okay. Give me 1 second here.
If you're ready to go.
Yeah, so the focus of this is on the article you wrote, right?
That's right. Well, I co-authored with Dr. Ledet and his wife, Sharon. We all wrote this together. I provided the field notes. Sharon provided the good writing, and then Rich provided the academic literature and all that kind of stuff. So,
all right, fair enough.
Let me start this by saying this. Hey, this is P.D. Turner, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Great to be back on the Break It Down show. All right, so Pete, I mean, today it looks like I'm kind of interviewing you about this opus, this piece, this publication that you have produced. I've got this right here in front of me, examining the ground truth from military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, engaging Islam, state building, and NATO's involvement in modern. There are quite a few questions here. I guess the first for the viewers, because I'm going to share this on my social media and so on. I think people will engage with it. But for people that haven't read this, what is the piece about, Pete?
Well, it's just about when we deploy as a coalition, whether it's the U.S. or NATO, UN, whatever it is, we tend to look at the separation of church and state as a norm throughout the world, and it's just not. We have the power of religion at our fingertips. Now, our default in the U.S. is to be afraid of it or to weaponize it. How do we go after the sheikhs that are bad, that are saying things that we don't agree with? And those are viable things, I suppose, but more appropriately is how do you use religion to your advantage? How do you recognize its impact on the people there? If you're going to state build and the state that you're helping to establish is founded in Islam, has Sharia law, you have to at some point deal with religion, and you can't just say don't go to mosques. And so the point of the paper was to say, hey, we have to do a better job of this. These modern wars are complex things. And to simply dismiss something because it's uncomfortable, that's just not going to work.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, the paper then is about how members of Western military forces, not even really just the USA, can more engage with Islam when we find that we have guys on the ground in Muslim countries. So I guess the second question would be sort of how. I mean, you talk about how the military can more effectively engage with religion in these states, in these spheres. How can they do that? What are some examples you've seen from your time in? What are some things you'd recommend, so on down the line?
Yeah, there are so many different examples. I mean, there's examples when it causes stability, instability. It's a negotiation tool. So the first example we use, these are ground truth things. This is not academic theoretic stuff. This actually happened. There was this long-term, multi-decade land dispute in this place where we were in Zabul province, which is south-central Afghanistan, literally and sort of figuratively too. And the governor there, once we got out of his way and started allowing him to govern and lead, he said, well, here's the first problem I want to take on. The Taliban could never solve this thing. And so what he did, and the thing with this guy is he was a government leader, which is a thing there, right? But the government doesn't have the same impact that it has here. He also was a former Mujahideen commander during the Russian war, so he had respect as a warrior. But he also, and what the villagers called him was mullah, because he had that religious leadership role. And so he used that influence, that religious influence, to gather farmers and elders together and say, hey, we need to put this thing to bed. Look, I know we can do this. And he used that influence as a religious leader, as a scholar, to unite people and go, yeah, we are going to put this to bed. And one of the things, it was possible because he's like, hey, I want you to leave us alone for about 2 weeks while we sort through the negotiations. I'm working on something. He didn't tell me what it was. He just said, we're working on something. Just stay away and I'll get a hold of you when it's time. And then I'll let you I'll let you watch and everything. And so I did. I came in at the last moment, the last meeting when they were all going to agree, and they all signed, they all thumbed off on this agreement. And I did nothing. He resolved this multi-decade conflict, like it's like a family feud that had dead bodies involved and everything. It was this whole thing. And again, the Taliban couldn't resolve it, but he did, because he leaned on the power of religion. And one of the things I learned that day when I watched that meeting was the meeting all of a sudden became real, because leading up to that, there weren't really any, other than him, any religious leaders there. But once they were ready to sign off, there was religious representation there as well. You see them with the long white beards, they show up, and they don't normally show up for things. And so that clued me in that something had happened with the religion part. And he explained all this to me. He's like, this is part of what we have to do in Islam. We have to get past these things.
Yeah, so I mean, that's obviously a very useful, practical example. Have you seen other cases like this that come to mind immediately?
Yeah, and they don't always work. So one of the things is a lot of these farmers, same guy, he's like, look, here's what I want to try this time. And this is a while later. We'd built up a lot of trust during this time. He's like, I want to get these farmers to not grow poppy. It was the area where we grew poppy. And he's like, so I know we have this government program, but people don't believe in the government. So I have to try to use other things. So I'm going to use the power of Islam to get these farmers to agree. And then he's like, ultimately, I don't expect them to do this, but if I can get the government to do its job and provide resources to these farmers, or at least the promise, like, hey, I have this money. Did you grow poppy? Oh man, maybe next year. And that's what he wanted to do. Well, the government failed. The money didn't show up. And so he used Islam to get these guys to nominally shake their head. Yes, we won't grow poppy, but the back end, the government part, the state building part failed. And so in that case, religion did its part, state failed this time.
Fair enough. Yeah. So actually, I'm going to take this. I've read through the paper. I'm rereading through it now. One of the things that you're talking about goes well beyond Islam, really. And I mean, you mentioned that in the West, there's this norm of separation of church and state. I think another norm that I've observed as a political scientist, and for that matter, that I've observed as the third world traveler, is that people expect governments to exist, cutting out some adjectives in front of exist. I mean, we expect there to not be bandits. We expect there to be, the term in political science is state level order. Right. So we expect there to be the government based in DC that has little provincial governments that are based in Nashville and Frankfurt and other cities. And when the government says something, most people just do it. If you put up a sign that says 70 miles an hour is the speed limit, people will cheat by 10 miles an hour, but you'll see people basically following this rule. Everyone drives on the same side of the road. You won't see animals in the road. I mean, we've both been in other places. I'm not going to go on about this at length. But I mean, in many other states, in many other countries would be a better way to put this, this doesn't seem to exist. Right. And I actually have a theory about why it doesn't exist. So in poli-sci, there are multiple levels of organization that humans have achieved over the years. So there's the band, which is just a small group of people hunting, living almost in a wild state, a state of nature. There's the tribe, which is what most Native American Indian communities have gotten to. You have a large, stable, fortified village. It has good warriors. You hunt and you farm outside it. Then there's the chiefdom, which is one guy who, through his own power, his own authority, has come to control a good stretch of land. Like Samoa was a chiefdom before the whites got there. And then there's the state, which is what we have now, the organized monarchical or democratic government with law, written language, so on. My opinion is that what you have in a lot of countries is societies that were still at the level of tribes or chiefdoms. There's nothing wrong with that. My white and black ancestors, if you look at Ireland, were like 800 years ago. But they were still at that level when sort of the conquerors arrived. So the government was kind of superimposed over this network that already existed. So what people refer to as warlords to some extent are often just the former chiefs that are where they always were, doing what they always did. And when you've talked to me about Afghanistan, kind of off the record, that's the impression I get. Like you'd have the Hazara region of the country, and within that region, you'd have 21 strong chiefs who each controlled 3 villages or something like that. And so the idea of the government, like the big government over in Kabul, would probably be meaningless to most people who aren't Kabulis, who have a college. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's completely correct. I mean, when we were, first off, the Americans, we would say we were nation building. And it's like, really what we were doing was state building. And whatever Rich's Weberian influence on me is showing. But we didn't even know exactly what we were doing, right? So now we try to do it. We try to make Kabul relevant 800 miles away or however far away we were. Afghanistan's about the size of Texas, so it's a pretty big place. Yeah. And if you're nowhere near any kind of government influence or result, you can put a solar powered traffic light up in the middle of Mizan or Arghandab district, but no one's stopping for that thing. I mean, it's just not going to happen. Right. So, it goes that same thing where you can have a government, but it doesn't have governance. And so there has to be governance. Who's doing that? And like you said, it's these family elders. It's these influential farmers or businessmen that are like, hey, we have to have some kind of order so we can make some money and survive.
Yeah, and I mean there are terms for those things. I mean, like there's the big man, there's the yo man. I mean, in Black and Celtic communities, we were doing this stuff 500 years ago. I mean, the English were doing this 1,000 years ago. Right. So it's the same system. You vassalage. You have like the big guy, and the top 10% of the men are his fighting men, and then everyone else is out there farming. And the one exception, the one other path is to become a cleric, I would assume, Muslim or Christian, if you go into Eastern Europe. So that's that. The thing about this is why I never get that mad about the Confederacy. I mean, we kicked their ass, we won, good. But the idea that this is some kind of unique evil, like you have the brutalized serfs, and then you have the fighting men, and then you have the Lord, the Massa, that's not something new and unique. That's what we had through all of history. Like, we had to beat that in our Confederacy or in our war with Mexico. So, like, that's what always existed. And in Afghanistan, you see it. So the question, and tell me at any point if you want to redirect to like a specific page of the paper. I've read the paper. The paper's good. But I mean, like, one question that seems obvious for boots on the ground guys, especially at the NCO and officer level, is that there's a conflict there, right? So, I mean, like, you have the government, and we're often patting the government on an ass and telling them how great they are and saying these positive things. And this goes well beyond Afghanistan, if you remember Chalabi in Iraq and so on. Right. On the other hand, if you want to get anything done on the ground, you're probably working with the chiefdom level warlords and yeomen, leading farmers, clerics. So how would you advise after the paper that people, how would you advise that whether it's war fighters or whoever else, people handle that balance? Like, how can you work with the chiefdom without making the government seem powerless?
Yeah, I mean, to create power with the government, you had to start with really small, like microscopic little wins. Like this win with this multi-decade land dispute was invisible. We had no idea it was even possible. We didn't know it existed because ultimately it wasn't our business, Mm-hmm. So we just proceeded and going, here's how we're going to partner. We're going to tell you what to do. What I was able to do was get the military to back off this guy. And he actually laid out this plan, like, here's what I want to do in this district. And so that enables us to work below that level, that ground truth level. So one of the things we'd often do is hand out like hand crank solar powered radios so that we could communicate with these distant areas, right? And we did this in Iraq. We do this wherever we go. The thing is that we only put out our messaging. So we have a bunch of country folk. These are farmers, and farmers around the world do not want the government in their business, right? They'll take some help, but they don't want you in their business. And so we were asking about, because I'm always curious about how this messaging is working, because it's U.S. directed. Sure, it's an Afghan guy writing it and recording it, but is it resonating? And so I go out and I talk to these guys, and they're working on religion, right? The U.S. is creating content based upon Islamic prayers and everything. And so I say, hey, how is this aspect of what's on the radio? And they look at me and they're like, who do you have reading this stuff? These are country folk. And I mean, if you look, you go 20 miles outside of Frankfurt, people get real different real fast, real fast. Now we're talking something the size of Texas, and Dallas is putting out a religious message to Marfa. That ain't going to work, And so these things where you're looking for the government to be realistic and have any kind of influence, we have to be out of the way. And so my advice often is just to quit doing so much stuff. If we have a radio that we can use, let's work with our partner who we're supposed to trust and say, I have this radio. How would you like to use it? And then do things like track what villages show up, or like we would, I call them measures of affect. We typically say effect-based things like, the Afghans tell us they love to hear music on there. They want to hear Britney Spears. Okay, well, that's adorable, nice. That doesn't help us make the government legitimate. So my advice would be do less, focus on building trust, figure out where the work is, and then get below that level of work and do the least amount possible to see if the government works.
Yeah, so I think that there are a couple of kind of tough, knotty questions there. I mean, and I'll kind of go through them in order. The first question, when you're talking about countries like Afghanistan, which are, I mean, there's a famous joking term from, I think, Winston Churchill, they're arguments with borders. The Western nations and the Arab lords drew the wrong borders around a lot of these countries years ago. That's why, I mean, in my opinion, you have Kurdistan spread out among really 3 countries. There's a pretty well-defined region called Kurdistan. The people that live there know what it is. U.S. troops relax when they're inside that border. But that's split up between, you might correct me, like Turkey, Iran, and Iraq or something wild. I mean, so... And Syria. Okay, yeah. But I mean, so in a lot of these questions, in a lot of these cases, like getting back to Afghanistan, I think the first question is a state government possible? I mean, when you talk about Afghanistan, as I understand, used to be governed by sort of a tribal meeting to the extent it was governed at all. Like the representatives of the different regions would send in their lord and he would negotiate with all the others and there'd either be peace or a war.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the things too, is we read the book, right? We know that that's a thing. And so we try to create these jirgas or these other, and we always use their term for a meeting. And then what we don't realize is that, yeah, those things exist because there's a bubble of influence. And then once you are transporting goods or people through that bubble of influence, you have another bubble and another bubble. And so someone needs to know you're coming through their area because, look, young dudes are dumb. And if you read the books about Afghanistan, they get into fights, they steal things, they don't give way, and they brush shoulders when they go by each other, and they start wars that way, right? And so you need the adults in the room, the men, the family leaders to go, yeah, that's just Abdul. I'll take care of that. And then the other guy's like, I got an Abdul too, and then they parent their way out of it, and that's that governance piece. So is it possible? When there were no roads. There wasn't even a road to the roads. Yeah. And so you have to keep in mind that, like, if you want the government to show up and do something, that's one of my favorite questions to ask. Rich and I both, we would love to do it. Like, we point at the government center if it was at all visible or orientable. We'd say, what happens in that building? And then people would laugh in our face. So is it possible? Yeah, maybe. There's like whole sections on the map. Like when we were there, it's 2012, 2011 timeframe. And there was a district called Arghandab, just right up the river, up the Arghandab River from where we were at. We didn't even go there anymore. We had pulled back all of our resources. There was no government there. It's fully 2 districts, 2 counties off of the main route. So no one's going there. Another district was completely just grayed out on the map. The shape existed, but we didn't even go there. So yeah, I mean, how do you stand in front of someone and say we're building governance when you can't even make a hospital show up somewhere and stay viable for 6 months without you doing every single thing for them? So I don't know. It's a hard question. I mean, Africa is gigantic. How do you stabilize Africa with the state government? I don't know that that's possible, reliably and repeatedly possible. We all believe that we do it, but the reality is we don't, and we freak out. Well, you'll get this. This will go to your political science thing. We think that there's only one kind of rule of law, and we call it informal governance. They just call it, government. I don't call it informal. For them, it is the actual government. They don't say government. They just say, yeah, we go through our tribal system to accomplish these things, up to and including solving murder, dealing with the outcome of that. It's a civil thing. They don't want a penal system because there's no way to have a penal system work. So if you can't have a penal system and you're only going to have a civil-based court system, we have to start with that is the reality right now. That's that ground truth thing. That is the reality. This is a civil-based court system here. If we're going to bring in this other system, it's going to take a lot of work to change that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some interesting points there. And again, one of the things I keep coming back to, because I mean, in the West, we fought the Arabs a lot, or Afghans aren't Arabs, but the various peoples of the Middle East.
Right. And
I think there tends to be some anger or even some bias there. Again, I'll say history, anything, English history, all this was very common. It's not even primitive. It's medieval. It's what we had until very recently. Like the term for the grayed out area on the King's map is no man's land. And they're jokes about that in French and German history. When the Spanish fought the Aztecs, there were areas where neither group would go, where there were supposedly cannibal tribes. I'm sure there were. And it was just, yeah, those are the cannibals down by the river. No one of us wants to rule them. It is what it is. And the point, though, is that there are still countries like this today. So, I mean, the question, it seems like you asked my question, but this is the big one, really, when it comes to nation building. Can you go into Afghanistan, or even not just picking on the Middle East, can you go into Congo, since we're talking about Africa, quote-unquote Black Africa? Can you go into Congo or Afghanistan, or for that matter, Chechnya, and set up a modern government? Is that even possible?
I mean, you can try, right? Like as soon as we're leaving, everybody's thinking the Chinese are going to come in and put in some kind of government system. What they don't realize is that to physically drive a truck from one end of Afghanistan to the other is not only a perilous thing, you're probably going to break your vehicle. I mean, vehicles are always in some form of disrepair. We had one of the things, the units would come in and they'd fall in on the old vehicles. You don't bring your own. You just take what's there and you use it. And we're like, hey, these vehicles are worn out. You're welcome to try to go down south and go find the Taliban, but you're not going to make it very far because these things are gigantic beasts of burden. It's like, I mean, it's like Hannibal bringing, elephants across the Alps. That happened once, I'm like, fuck that, that's too hard. And so that's the thing, right? How are you going to build governance with this new fledgling government, especially? And this is the thing, I love to like take the packet of information that would leave the ground where I was. Hey, we got into a firefight. I saw it with my own eyes. We got into a firefight. The cops request new bullets because they had spent bullets, right? And so, okay, where does that request go next? And he's like, I sent it to Bob, And so then I go, when I get a chance, I go see Bob, and I'm like, where does that thing go next? And quickly that request disappears outside of my ability to follow it.
Yes.
I don't know specifically, but I would almost guarantee that most of the time that request is killed by an American who thinks that my Afghan guy that I'm working with is a bad dude. And so they kill the request. And so ammo never comes back down through the governmental exchange. And when it does, you're like, holy shit, that worked. And so it's such a surprise when it does. You don't think, how do we repeat this lesson so we can actually show that there are provisions and these places are provisionable. So if you can't provision, and this is across every ministry, right? So Afghanistan is full of minerals and hard, all kinds of rare earth metals and everything else. Did we have a dedicated Ministry of Mining partnership going on? No. Well, how are you going to pull this place out if you don't even cover all of the ministries? And does it take a lot of people to do that? Yes. But how do you make a government work if you're not going to work on create capacity across the entire government? We love dealing with police and military, with those kind of things, and we can probably build pretty good capacity there. Doesn't mean we can get people to call the cops. Yeah. Maybe there's not even phones in that valley because there's no electricity. It's really literally the Stone Age. So these are the things that, can you make it happen? Sure, but you have to slow down and get the basics right and create. If you don't have a security, how that people in that valley, how they view security, if you don't have that, then there is no government. It's all back to the old stuff.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, again, this gets into, without being too repetitious here, I mean, this gets into what people usually discover when they leave functional countries for non-functional countries.
Yeah.
Like even in Latin America, which is moderately functional, it took me a couple of days to realize that mañana meant never. Like you'd walk down to the bus station and ask him, hey, when's the bus coming? I'm trying to, take a trip. Mañana, okay, maybe. You'd go there the next day. When's it coming? Again, tomorrow. And you eventually realize like the bus probably isn't coming because it's entirely possible that the driver just stopped in a village to hang out with his girlfriend. And no one's going to stop you from doing that. He owns the bus. There's one bus in this particular region,
yeah.
So it's just, maybe you start walking or maybe you find a friend from the region with a car, but I mean, in Afghanistan, I assume you'd see the same problems, X a factor of 10. So the idea of we're going to take a modern military caravan north to fight the enemy, I mean, you need the things that most Americans would associate with that. You need ammunition, you need weapons, you need operators, bravery, but you also need shit you don't think about, like roads. I mean, so when you see those videos of the special forces guys riding horses in Afghanistan, they're not doing that just to be, knife sharpening, push-up doing badasses. They're doing that because there aren't any streets.
Yeah.
So the way you get to, the sizable village of your allies is by mule. So that's, again, that's an interesting situation. So, I mean, we kind of went through this question of should you try state-level governments there at all? I think a follow-up and this is getting a bit away from the paper, but a follow-up to that is generally in political science, where I think this paper will be cited, when we see governments that are successful in the developing world, they're not governments we like. I mean, almost always successful developing world governments either have a strong king, like Botswana, for example. Success story in Africa, certainly not a dictatorship. But as I recall, the royal house still runs a lot of the things that happen on a day-to-day basis in the country. So you're talking about a king, or you're talking about Saudi Arabia. I mean, they have a king and the country is essentially a theocracy.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can talk about the Arabs, they're our rivals, so on, but Saudi Arabia went from being essentially some tent camps in the desert to what it is today over a period of perhaps 70 years. It's a highly successful nation building story. But again, I mean, King Fahd and King Saud, all those people from the editorial pages in the US in the 90s and the 00s were the people responsible. So what's your take on that? I mean, the governments that are most likely to work, pulling the developing world up to the next level when you start voting on parliaments, from a practical perspective, are very likely to be king-like dictatorships. They're very likely to be theocracies like Iran's. Like in practice, some of what you see in Eastern Europe, I mean, it would be very difficult to be a Muslim and settle in those countries. So should the West support the government that's likely to bring peace, even if it is a theocratic dictatorship? I mean, that's the blunt question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to at least start there, because the energy it takes to override that and put something else in, which, by the way, makes you an insurgent. So if you're going to topple or undermine this other system, you'd better well know what the system is. You better have trust. I mean, I would guess in large part the Saudi government worked because a lot of people got paid, and paying in a tribal society is really tough. Like, so just let's back it down to the basics. Another thing you have to have besides roads is electricity. And one of the favorite questions someone asked me in all these places I've been was, how long would your government work without any electricity? And I'm like, 8 minutes tops. I mean, we already have large areas, even California, where we're all crazy here, where people are like, yeah, mask mandate, go ahead and enforce it. And the sheriffs are like, not doing it. I mean, it depends on where you live and everything else. Tribal all of a sudden, right? I mean, that's very tribal. Like these guys here, they're more pro-business, and you're all big people. We're not going to enforce this thing. So these are the things that happen. So to change that, you need some kind of overriding force or misery or anything else. I mean, we're still figuring out what Yugoslavia is. Right now, a piece of Bosnia is trying to break away and be its own little Serbian, micro government. And so this stuff continues to happen and sorts it out. So what can you do as the U.S. or as NATO, if we're going to stay on the paper, is chill out strategically, and unless you are really willing to go do the work below the tactical level, the ground truth level, because things like courts and hospitals, they have all that stuff. It may not be what we recognize as being good, but it is what they recognize as being what's available. And until you're willing to change that reality, again, that takes a lot of energy. You can't reliably go do it. You can think it, you can fund it. But the thing is when you and I go out there the next day to the hospital after everybody else has left, I'm like, what happens here? And they're like, oh, this is a Farm Bureau office. We come here because there's, we would find out what really happens. And that doesn't matter if you're in Central America or in Central Asia. You're going to find out what the reality is once everybody else leaves and that immediate influence or performance is gone. A lot of what we get is performative things where we think we see the government. But if you bother to go back a day or a week or a month later, you find out what really happens. And it's a lot more of that village to village tribal norm, not the government norm.
Yeah, and I think that's what you'd see in any society if you went into that society and tried to impose a completely different set of norms.
Right.
Like this might seem totally pulled out of an ass at first, but there's a great set of science fiction books called the Ember Verse. It's about a world actually where electricity stops working. As I recall, all fusion explosions stop working, and like gunpowder is the simplest fusion explosion and so on. So like nothing works. And essentially, 2/3 of the population dies and people create other societies. But at one point, one guy who had been a professor of medieval history at a highly ranked university, he's actually, I think, modeled on a real guy at Stanford, who's supposedly kind of crazy. But he becomes king of a sizable area. And he decides that obviously, given the available technological level, he's going to return to the Middle Ages. I'm not sure if it's Stanford where this guy was based, but anyway. So he actually appoints like his warriors, who are mostly former military guys, as barons and lords, and sends them out to control certain areas of land with the few people he has that know how to fight with traditional weapons. And the point of all this is that this is accepted while the guy's warriors are there. But as soon as they leave to go campaign or for a day or two, everyone reverts back to being normal Americans. And this causes an incredibly bloody war. And the book is actually darkly funny. But I mean, when you think about that, how would you react if the electricity went off, the mayor of your city declared himself king, and they started telling you to wear traditional garb like trews and tea tunics and so on? Would you simply go along with this? Or would you politely smile and nod and then resist massively and start stockpiling weapons and so on? That's what happens in general in nation building situations. So
yeah, for sure.
It sounds like you're frankly saying that in a lot of situations, it would make sense for us to work with the person who could actually bring peace, even if that is the king. I mean, is that correct?
I mean, if you're willing to stay for a long time and actually do the work, and that's the thing. It's like, we're not. The easiest way for us to get around was on little mini motorcycles, like 125cc, not powerful things. These are things that went along at like 5 to 10 miles an hour. If you hit a hunk of road, you can go faster, but That's how we got around. We wanted to have these gigantic bomb-proof houses that on wheels, and so it wasn't a viable way to approach the whole thing. So if we're going to take it seriously, and if we're going to actually act like we care, then yeah, we can do it. But we don't. We don't even train for this stuff. We don't even learn how to use interpreters. We don't teach interpreters how to be advocates and allies, and so we can't even do the basic things. And so better off just staying the hell out. And that's not because of isolation. It's just because it's complex, hard, delicate work that takes decades to get any kind of real progress, and it's a whole career commitment if you're going to go somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. So, I mean, what it sounds like you're saying, and I mean, this is, again, the basis of now a pretty serious academic paper. If we are willing to put out the time and effort, then it might be worth it to work with the local religious leaders and the chiefs, potential kings, so on. And if we're not willing to put out the effort, it's probably not even worth doing that. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a scenario there where you think it's worthwhile to invade other countries and try to make them into smaller versions of the USA. I mean, is that a misread?
I mean, I think if we're going to stay and work on certain parts of the government, there's some justification in that, just because by being there, we create this, not stability, we just create a more expensive instability where, hey, the Americans are over there and we cause some pushback. But I think one of the problems with all this, there's an example, it's in the paper, and it starts off great because there's a thing called the Ctesiphon Arch, right? Which is a Persian name. Yeah, it's a Persian monument, but in Iraq, it's called Takal Kasra. And that's my crappy Arabic. I'm sure they would say it different, but they have an Arabic name for this thing. And this thing's ancient and it should be a UNESCO heritage site. So we have it, we're sitting there, we're looking at it. We created no-fly zones over it because it's the oldest like clay arch in the world that's freestanding. Yeah, it's an incredible, what remains of a palace. And it's all surrounded by all these archaeologically rich tells that someone should be there studying. And the Iraqis, this is so great. The Iraqis come to us. First, we went to them and said, hey, we have an idea for how to work this thing. And the governor's like, I'm glad you brought that up. Here's my PowerPoint slide. And he brings this paper out and he's like, parks and people. And he's like, this is how you have to work this. There's going to be a casino over here. And that's going to be run by the Christian Kurds because they can safely, legally run a casino. Even though we all know we're all going to go, it can't be run by a Shia or a Sunni guy. Yeah. The right next door to this arch is a shrine to Muhammad's barber. His name was Salman al-Farsi, Salman the Farsi. And so, right, exactly. And so kids would go there to get their first haircut, especially if you were Shia, right? You would go over there and you would get this stuff done. So the Shia people would run that part of the tourist part. And then the police would protect the academic structure, the Ministry of Tourism, the Ministry of Antiquities. All of a sudden you have this multi-ministry partnership. And so we brought this whole thing. The Iraqis called all these people into this great meeting. We're like, yeah, let's take this to the State Department because that's really where this needs to go. You call those guys, too busy, no thanks. So who runs that now? That whole thing, because it is a viable thing. It's part of humanity, right? It's really important that we study this thing. Well, now the Iranians, who we are trying desperately to limit their influence, they run that thing now. They're the ones that partnered and got everything done because the Iraqis still wanted to do it. They were still desperate to get academic research. And so now it's an international coalition of people, but it's run by the Iranians. So you look and you see not only the religion part, but our inability to give two shits about this thing that could create stability in the region, jobs, money, all these things that we're trying to create. And we pissed it away because we couldn't be bothered to be bothered by it.
Yeah, that's extremely. So let me look for the exact passage in the paper here. But some of this was extraordinarily surprising to me. Like how we handled that situation certainly was. Mm-hmm. Where's this? Is this page 14? Water. Okay, so on page 16, you say you're talking about a couple of different things here, and you say, in typical fashion, this actually probably is the Ctesiphon Arch situation. In typical fashion, U.S. military elements took it upon themselves to create a development plan, but they did so without ever consulting key Iraqi leaders, such as the DGOV, whom Turner had spoken with frequently and in depth about instability in the area, about how these problems could be addressed in a way that meant progress occurring in accordance with local norms and traditions, etc. I guess the one sentence question that comes to mind from the academics, well, there are two questions. One, is that common that the U.S. Invaders is the wrong term, but the U.S. presence in the country engages in this? And two, why? Yeah. I mean, it would seem from a business perspective, as a merchant, it would seem kind of bizarre not to talk to your allies on the ground. I mean, even if they've been defeated in this round, I mean, why not? What do you have to lose? Yeah. Even if you're going to kill someone, be polite to them first, to quote Queen Elizabeth. So is that common, and why is it common? I mean, what's your take on that?
It's not just common, it's constant. It is the thing that we think we're supposed to do. And it's funny you say bizarre, because there's a great story of this one area we were in. We were constantly briefing this bizarre rebuilding project. And these are clay buildings, so it looks like a bunch of clay ruins.
Oh, yeah.
You put a little bit of water together and you put some products on some shelves, and all of a sudden this whole place comes alive. And so this American general shows up, and he's talking about how great the bazaar is going to be. Just all we got to do is get some micro grants out there and get some businesses started. All these people had businesses. They just weren't in this place anymore. Why? Because the Taliban said, you are not going to run that bazaar. And they said no. So instead of understanding that, he came in and blustered and everything else about all this stuff we were going to do. And the whole time we're all looking, I was embarrassed for the guy, because he was completely obsolete. This happens all the time. One of the things in the paper we talk about is our desire to create fresh water in areas. Now, and they had these little picture the cheapest you could build kind of cinder block house that had a water filtration system where you could constantly get fresh water out of it. Sort of a above ground freshwater well. Well, that requires maintenance. We weren't able to reliably create a maintenance function. Even if we handed them the filters, they weren't putting them in the thing. Then you find out that filter house creates problems with Iranians and influence and religion and intrigue and all these other things that you just can't even reliably sort out. And so the thing either freezes up from all the minerals going into it and everything else, or some other problem happens, or it isn't big enough for that region because it's a one-size-fits-all solution. Like, there's 500 houses here. This one little unit won't clear all the water that we needed to clear. So all these problems happen. You know who comes in and fixes it? The Iranian-backed Red Crescent. They come into the area and they're like, hey, we'll fix this thing, and we'll make sure you always have a filter. And right here, we've got this person who's our influencer here in the area, and he's going to make sure everybody knows it's okay that we use this thing to get fresh water. And so they take this American failed project and turn it into this Iranian influence-based success story in terms of getting fresh water.
Yeah, I mean, so it seems like what I'm taking from the paper and just from previous conversations is that there actually are some pretty basic things that U.S. would-be nation builders could do. Ask questions that are relevant to what's going on the ground. Listen to what people like the DGOV in your example say. Maybe learn to savvy the language a little bit. Be familiar with the level of government that exists. So don't be contemptuous of the warlord, quote unquote, although you might rein in some of the worst proclivities there, but recognize that those chiefdoms are the government, because the state, the government in Kabul, only runs Kabul and only by day. So, I mean, it seems, and I actually think people often make fun of kind of the egg-headed academic wonks, but I think this is a situation where a couple of university professors who were of Afghan or Arabic background would have been pretty useful. In terms of, although actually, I don't know about that. I think most academics I know wouldn't have left Kabul. They would have issued a lot of papers sitting in a coffee shop. I mean, so you need someone that could fight competently and that would go out there, at least run competently, and that would be willing to go out there and work with you guys and speak to the locals. And that would really be the problem with that would really be the issue with the academics involved. And yeah, I just saw one of the comments just now, and this is correct, I'm actually familiar with this situation, was so exactly the opposite of what those speaking on Ethiopia's current issues are doing. So yeah, the West has a habit of doing this, and it gets incredibly annoying because although most traditionally white societies are currently historically dominant, this has fluctuated wildly across time. So there's a tendency to view people like the Southeast Asians, the Ethiopian Africans, the Arabs, and so on as uncivilized. And in fact, I mean, those are cultures where most people do know what they're doing, that have existed for thousands of years. So, I mean, I agree with Dickie here that the same basic practice should go on in most of these situations. Right. Well, as someone who was a war fighter, I mean, you weren't, obviously you had some rank, but weren't a general. I guess the final question in this series is, what would you most like to see from those that are quote unquote placed over you? What should people with, flag rank or just even the guy down to the individual running one of these projects? What should they be ready to do to make that successful? I'm sure you have some opinions here.
Yeah, I have a lot of opinions on this. Be suspect of any claimed win. You know, this is the thing. We had this thing in where the Stefan Arches, right? There's a thing called the Green Medine. For whatever reason, development people love a co-op. And so they'll say, we're going to build this co-op, and we'd fund money into this thing. And there's all kinds of great suits and pretty Iraqi girls and great food, and we come visit. But if you went back a week later, you never saw any farmers in this co-op, you know, and then you're trying to establish a connection to the government. And so when we go around, like, who's the most influential guy around, you're like, oh, that guy that hands out money from this place over here. It's never the government, right? And so you have a problem of you're trying to legitimize and make this government work, and your own effort to create this co-op is undermining it. And it's turning into this. We always talk about corruption in foreign countries. We are the corrupter, right? When you bring a bunch of money in, well, stacks of $100 bills that I couldn't hold my hand. We're just pushing them across the table. The guy didn't even live in Iraq. He lived in Canada. He just put on a great suit when he came by and spoke English and charmed people. And so the generals would get briefed on this thing. State Department loved this thing. They would fly in from all over Iraq to come see this model organization. Like, model of what? What do you think is happening here? Mm-hmm. And what would they? Would get fed food, and they would see all these pretty girls, and they would be like, "Wow, what a success!"
Yeah, maybe a little more at night too. I mean, this is what happened with Saipan Island, which was famously nicknamed Blowjob Island. Like, it was the USA and China. You're familiar with Saipan, right?
Sure. Yeah.
USA and China were running this. They were running this slave-run sweatshop as kind of a horrible co-op deal on this island called Saipan. And the deal was that U.S. senators and congressmen, and even Chinese military people who are on occasion honorable, as opposed to, I would assume, senior CCP members, they would be flown out and they would encounter kind of the frontispiece of the island, which was a hotel. I mean, there were girls there. It later turned out not necessarily willingly, but they were more than willing to entertain. Kind of Joy Girls was the theme. You know, you were served this delicious meal, and you got to see your two nations working together. And on the other side of the island, over, as I recall, a small mountain range, was just these slave barracks. And this was just never exposed, never discussed, because there was never any reason to discuss it. Everyone just saw the face. Right. And that goes back a long time. I mean, like, Potemkin villages, as you know, were a real thing. Like, this Russian official just built fake serf towns that they could drive guilty members of the nobility through. Meanwhile, the actual serfs were, you know, pushing plows with their hands in a totally different set of villages. So yeah, that's a good piece of advice. Watch out for Potemkin and his handiwork. Yeah. So two really, and we talk. I mean, we actually don't like each other in real life. We can talk as long as you want. But I have two on my list of questions. They're kind of two final ones that are pretty sweeping. The first is, when you look at NATO and these sort of comprehensive, do we need NATO at all? Should the USA be part of these kind of old nation-building alliances that were designed to fight the Russians at all? I talked to one of the most physically dangerous people I know, former military guy, current martial arts sensei, and one of the smartest, who teaches at my old University of Illinois, brilliant guy. But I was sitting down talking to them once, and I said random 9/11 came up, and both of them pretty much said, you know, after 9/11, you know, I would have delivered some kind of devastating equivalent strike. Like, I would have focused all of our intelligence agencies on hunting bin Laden and then, you know, crucified him in the White House lawn was the line. Or I would have destroyed, you know, some major buildings in Afghanistan or Iraq, assuming there are any, was also a joke in that conversation. And then I would have kind of gone home. Like, they would have been punished. They would have lost 5,000 for our 3,000. It's fair. But I wouldn't have conquered the country. Maybe Afghanistan, certainly not Iraq. So when you look at this whole idea of Western nation building, I mean, to some extent, that is a legacy of colonialism. I mean, that's what the West used to do, you know, show them the price of a white man's head kind of thing. Britain would lose a merchant overseas and a civilized POC power like Ashanti. So they'd fight a bloody war. They'd lose 15,000 people. They'd take over Ashanti. Now it's Ghana. Should we still be doing this at all? Or should we just respond with targeted missiles and so on when there's an act of terror?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And it's funny because at this conference, we were celebrating, you know, the 70 years of NATO, and there's a lot of people saying a lot of things. I'm shaking my head because it's not based in reality. One of the things is one of these American, he's a student, so we'll give him a break, but he stands up and says, when do you think Russia will join NATO? And then we all looked around like, what? And the Estonians especially were like, what is going on?
You know, it's like 40, 60.
Yeah. So for those that don't know, Estonia and Russia, I mean, NATO exists in part to help Estonia be Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, to check up the Russians. So when you ask, should NATO exist? I mean, here's an example right now. Are we gonna allow NATO? Are we gonna lead NATO as we try to push Russia back in the Crimea and all the Ukrainian questions? I mean, this is why NATO is there, right? Sure, NATO can be like this European-based UN, like it was in Yugoslavia, and relatively successful at that. But should it exist? I don't know. I mean, is everybody going to jump in when there's something to work on? For example, like Ukraine, are we going to back Ukraine up or not? And if not, then maybe that's not an alliance that we need to invest in. And maybe we just focus on the Baltics, the Poles, the White Russians, and just get those folks what they need to stand there, to be able to stand up and not have Russia, constantly threatening them. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to that, but it is a real question. And in general, any of these things, if we're going to go do them, we have to be willing to do that British thing and go on the ground and stay there for an entire career and marry a Belarusian, woman, or marry an Indian woman and become part of that society. Because if we're not willing to spend entire careers there, you can't develop the capacity. It's too hard of a job to come in for 9 months or a year or even a year and a half and do a job you're not trained to do. And then every time you come back, do a different job in a different place. And that's how you build an insane country like Afghanistan. You can't just repeatedly come back and do a totally different job, not be prepared, and just think that you did a good job, which is really what State Department and everybody else does. I have very little respect for the State Department success, because in places like Afghanistan, they were horrible at it. I mean, they're arrogant. These are academics that might know a lot more about Afghanistan than I do, but give us 2 weeks and put us both in a far removed village, and I guarantee you I'll be alive and they'll be dead. I mean, they don't know what they're doing, and they're making these decisions at a strategic and theoretic level. And here's an example of that.
That's a good point.
I was working just outside of Sadr City. So I'm in Baghdad, and it's in the area where they launch mortars at the Green Zone. And so one of our jobs was to patrol around and just be like a random free radical trying to catch a mortar team, or just to make it hard for them to go out there. And so I had a couple of Iraqis that were working with me, and they would go up into Sadr City and they'd bring information out, because we weren't allowed to go up there. And it was a dangerous place. So we were just, causing less problems by not going up. And I happened to go back to the big palace where all of the academics were. And the guy's like, I'm writing a paper on Sadr City. And I'm like, oh, that's fantastic. You're in such great luck. I've got a number of guys that can go up there and ask questions all the time and get you, actual live information from the place. And he's like, yeah, no, thanks. I've got all I need already. And I'm like, wow, you're going to write a book or a paper. You're going to advise the military, and you're not even going to take live information coming. And this is the problem with the academics. They'll tell me about the rose gardens planted by Alexander and how they saw those once. But what about that dude 2 blocks over who actually is the guy that was responsible for watering those roses? And, these are the things that we don't want to take the time to do. And if we're not going to take the time to do it, if we're not going to understand that religion is part of a governing structure in most other countries, then, we need to think hard about, should we be involved with it at all?
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting example that you gave. I mean, where you're kind of on the front lines in this country as, a highly intelligent guy, and you say, well, this is the information I have on the ground. And someone openly says, well, that contradicts my theory. I don't necessarily want that information. That's almost like a joke about academics. I actually find this to be a big issue in the social sciences right now. Like, everybody wants kind of original new publications. Everyone wants to be kind of edgy, and everyone leans left. I mean, I would be on the hard right for modern academia. So you have these very prevalent theories, like Dr. Kendi's idea that every gap in performance between groups is due to racism. And what people are doing is trying to test the theory. So in every situation, someone might look and examine and say, well, is there racism here? And I've looked at some of these studies, and they're quite good. They usually find there's a 1 or 2% effect of racism, sometimes more. Like, in audit studies for job applicants, you can get up to like 20%. But the obvious question is, like, what's the other 90 or 95%? Like, so your theory explains 5% of this. Do you have a theory for the other 95% of it? And when you ask someone that, they seem totally baffled. So it's the same thing I would assume in the foreign policy context, where like the theories there would be things with names like realism, trade liberalism, constructivism. So someone might say, I'm a trade liberal. I expect people to behave reasonably. Like, okay. But that doesn't mean anything. What you're generally going to have in that situation is someone watch what actually happens on the ground and then kind of interpret it to fit the theory. Like, yeah, look, they behaved reasonably. And the reality is, Bill, I mean, that's 1/3 of the possibilities. Like, you could have said that about almost literally anything. So yeah, academics aren't necessarily always all that useful. I do think one of the big things I have, whether you're talking about the soldiers or, you know, the big brain guys, would be, not that those two groups don't overlap, but I mean, one of the questions I have would be, what percent of the people that the USA sent into Afghanistan speak the languages like Dari and Pashto or whatever?
No, I mean, it doesn't even exist. You know, we get this training, and one of the things that we're taught every single time we go somewhere and we're learning in the host nation's language, they teach us how to say in the native tongue, "Do you speak English?" And I always raise my hand and I say, "Why are we learning this?" The phrase, we already know it. We just say, "Do you speak English?" And they either say "nam" or "la" or whatever, right? They just answer it. No, or they go, "Yeah, man, I speak English." You know, I went to London.
That's what I was going to say. In like a Persian or an Afghan city, like, I mean, I would assume every 20th person has an uncle who owns a restaurant in Cleveland. So like, yeah, they can speak English, but that's a point failure source. Like your interpreter, who, no offense, probably a brave guy, but could be a terrorist, speaks, you know, English and Pashto fine, but you don't. Yeah. So, I mean, this is kind of an easy softball, but I mean, is that something, again, you would do in an overall kind of leadership role? Like, everyone
I wouldn't teach any foreign language capacity at all. And I would rather they spend that money taking two dudes and like a interpreter collector team and send them to country X to survive. Because here's the thing is you can't learn enough languages. Like, so the language we all learned, the language of Afghanistan to us, just goes to the whole thing, was Dari. Okay. But what if you're in Pashtunistan, you know, or Baluchistan, and you speak a slightly different version of that, you know, and you think that you know Arabic and the Quran, and all of a sudden they're speaking, and you're like, what are you talking about? That's not. So all of these things, it's too much to keep up with. And actually, I just had a guy, Daniel Levin, on the show. He speaks Arabic and French and a whole bunch of other languages. He likes to have an interpreter too, because it slows down the pace of the conversation. And I totally get what he says, because I do the same thing. I can now look at body language. I can test my body language assessment because I'm watching this person talk. I can think of the right question to ask, because often the first question I think of is garbage. Yeah. The best question is I need time to formulate it, right? And so I'd rather see that we build the capacity to deal with culture and to be able to see that, hey, you're talking about rule of law. Let me figure out what rule of law is here right now. Like, what is the current state of things right here? So that I can find, like, where is the work? Is the work in creating rule of law? No, they have it. The work is, what kind of rule of law do they have? And where are some gaps that maybe we can fill? We had court systems, right? We had it's in Afghanistan. Same thing in Iraq, though. And so we'd had all these judges, and I would love to go talk to the judges. Hey, what do you do here? Well, I hear cases. How many cases a month do you hear? None. How come? Well, you know, the other system already works, and so no one brings me cases. Occasionally, you know, just to make you guys happy, we'll hear one. And so these are the kind of things where if you don't have someone on the ground, and by the way, when that person on the ground reports that stuff, we need to take him seriously. You know, that person you were talking about earlier, talking about realism and liberal realism and determining, you know, what normal and is rational. That person's not trained to do that. That person, pre-deployment training is shooting their rifle, making sure their soldiers can shoot their rifle. They're doing battle maneuvers and all these other things, all appropriate for a lethal military, but not at all appropriate for someone who's 22 years old, got a degree at a state school, and they're out there. And look, and God bless all that stuff. It's all good things, but you're in no way prepared for this fight. You don't even know how to build trust in a place where trust is essential to operate. So someone like me, I can go out because I'm an expert in this, and I can go meet people that no one, the military's been there for 10, 15 years. They've never met all the people in that region who have influence. I can meet those guys. Not in 2 weeks. It takes longer than that, but I can do that because I know how to navigate trust and culture better than they can. So that's what I would teach them, how to actually systematize trust and rapport. Don't just say build rapport. How do you do it? How do you know when you have it? How do you build trust? And those kind of things. I think if you're not willing to do that, Will, then you can't reliably send people there and expect them to do anything other than just report back successes. Most everybody has no idea what they're doing. That's just the God's honest truth, because they're not prepared to do it.
Yeah, that's really interesting and useful. Yeah. So, I mean, you wouldn't focus so much on something that sounds good, like language capability. You'd focus on this full kind of toolbox of skills, and then you'd have trustworthy interpreters or whatnot sent over with the troops or meet them on the ground or something like that. Okay.
Yeah.
That's probably an even better idea. So, I mean, again, there seems to be a whole consistent lineup of things that you've been saying, like listen to what people on the ground are saying, especially if you're going to call them allies, ask them coherent questions, be suspicious of claimed wins, look at what the actual conditions are. So, I mean, a king is better than a bunch of bickering noblemen. So if your two options are bickering noblemen and a king, you might want a king. There's no point in saying, well, wouldn't it be great to have a liberal democracy where women vote? One of the things that's weird is that when we go into situations like this, we often almost create, I think you could say this about the French in Cambodia, you could say this about the USA in Kabul, but we often almost create this group of kind of quasi-Americans that are probably going to be massacred when the actual ruler of the country takes power to some extent. Like, that's why it was so important to get so much of the population of the capital city out of the country. And you could ask whether there's any productive value to that. Like, we're conveying our culture, which is here in 2021, to a small number of like feminist girls in this city in a country that other than that is operating at like 14, 15. You know, no difference in IQ or anything else potentially, but that's where the country's stabilized. You have mountains dividing every valley from the next. So yeah, I mean, getting together a king who could unify all the valleys, or whatever title you want to give that guy, the Lord Protector, the first Premier, I mean, would seem to me more useful than hoping and dreaming and controlling the capital. The final question here, I mean, because this is a paper about how people on the ground can work with religion in the local context. What are the things? I'll actually just phrase this question in a really stupid form to see how you answer it. Then I'll ask a smarter version. God damn it. But I mean, so like, is Islam the enemy? Like, when we're in the Middle East, are we fighting Islam or radical Islam or something like that? Or is Islam just the religion that the people that are sometimes our enemies happen to have? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I mean, Islam is not our enemy. You know, Arabs are not our enemy. And a lot of times I refer to there's some academic terms that not everybody gets, and so I'll have to explain it. But I refer to our fights as co-belligerents. We're all fighting. And oftentimes that's at each other, but really we're competing for the local populace and their attention and the affect. Can you get them to believe in what you're selling, or will the other side get that? You're competing for these people. And by the way, I put a link up for the Afghan Constant. It has like some rules, some lenses for anybody who goes and does this work. You know, like it talks about your proximity to a high-end degree probably means that, and you'll appreciate this as a statistical analysis guy, your relation to failure is greater than 1, you know, because you're so unaware of your failure because you've got this Harvard degree that it's impossible for you to fail. So you continue to stack on this correlation to failure. So that's a good place to go for that. But getting back to your thing, yeah, I mean, obviously, look, Islam is not the problem. And the problem is us, because we'll literally have a bunch of chaplains looking at and analyzing information from the different mullahs or imams that are preaching out of the mosques. And instead of establishing people that are qualified to go into these mosques, and maybe they're from Jordan, we have partners from Jordan, why not they to do that? And then figure out where the religion is working, where it is stabilizing. Sure, there's some guys that need to be marginalized and maybe they need to be killed. Who knows? But we have resources to deal with this. Instead, when the Jordanian shows up and opens his mouth, we mock him because he's got an accent and, you know, he's not from America. He's clearly stupid. Meanwhile, the guy that I'm talking about in this case is the exact same rank as the commander of a brigade, which is 5,000 people and their peers in terms of military. And so we don't even respect this guy. So there's all kinds of things we can do if we're going to go do this stuff, but fearing Islam and being afraid to, and saying like, you know, oh, make sure we always teach our culture from a point of don't offend them. I've asked all these questions of all these guys, and I'm like, hey, I eat left-handed. Is that a big deal to you guys? It's a great icebreaker. And they're like, hey, Pete, you know what we know about you? You're not Islamic. You're an American. It means you're a Christian. Whether I'm a Christian or not, I don't ever correct them. I let them think that. Like, we know that you're going to do things differently. It's no big deal. And so you have to allow these things to be real. So rather than looking at Islam as a point of contention, look at it as a point of collaboration. And how do you find similarities? So the person looks at you and goes, that's just the dude who's trying to take care of his family back at home. And I appreciate him for being here. And he's always fun to talk to because he tells jokes and he doesn't tell me what to do. He just listens to me. I mean, it's easy to get along with a guy like that, you know?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the only real follow up to that would be when people talk about conflict. Oh, that's interesting. Morocco was the first country to recognize the USA. Yeah, I'm not surprised by that.
Good
But
job.
when people talk about our conflicts in the Middle East, I mean, one of the comments that you hear from people, George Bush would say this all the time, W. Bush. He wasn't, I don't think, virulently Islamophobic, but he frequently came up with lines like, they hate us for our freedom. The idea is sort of the motivation for attacks or for conflict with the USA behind, say, a specific bombing is Islam itself, or is enmity between civilizations. And I think the response to that would be, no, that's the justification you give to like the dumb young guys that you're sending out on the front line, bluntly. But the actual motivation for the attack would be some kind of practical, pragmatic reality. The Americans have advanced X number of miles into Anbar province or whatever.
Right.
Do you find that to be true, that religion's just used as a smokescreen for actual motivations, or are there a ton of fanatics in a country like Afghanistan or Iraq?
I mean, there's a ton of fanatics. People can get fanaticized and they're exploitable, and you can turn them into weapons, right? But I think ultimately, so we had this guy come in to one of our teams, and he was, educated in Islam, and he's like one of the first like era of people that 9/11 happens. I'm going to go learn about this. I'm going to learn Arabic. I'm going to learn about Islam, and I'm going to come in and I'm going to help. And so he came in with all these preconceived notions, and he thought truly that this was sectarian violence in Iraq. And I'm like, no, dude, it's politics. It's politics and money and power. And he's like, no, you're absolutely wrong. It matters who their marja is. And he kept asking, who's your marja? Who's your marja? Thinking he could map this. And most people look at him and I'm like, these are Rockies. They don't care about religion like we do. Like they don't care that we even care. They don't care. They drink, a lot of them drink whiskey during Ramadan and everything. So I took him into the secure area, a thing called a skiff. And I'm like, let me show you. And so there's this giant chart of all these people that we know and are collecting on and everything else. And I'm like, it'll take me a couple of seconds here. And I'm like, oh, right here, look, Iranian dude and a Saudi dude cooperating, because they both want Iraq to be not powerful. Iraq, when you leave them alone, they're a net exporter of food, can basically feed almost the entire Mideast all by themselves. They're just really powerful country. And neither one of their neighbors want that. And so all of a sudden, Shia and Sunni goes away, because we're talking about national security and all these other initiatives. And these are the things that matter way more than what religion is. One of the things too that we lose, because we're not good at instability. They are. Wherever we go, they're better at instability than we are. Mm-hmm. So one of the things, this guy got blown up one day, or actually I shouldn't say he got blown up. His house got blown up. He wasn't in it. And so I was asking the general in the area, and I'm like, what's going on with this? And he's like, it's just politics. If they wanted him dead, he'd be dead. But they don't want him to run for office. And so he's going to stop running for office, or the next bomb will kill him. Mm-hmm. And sure enough, that dude's like, I'm out of the race. I found other things to do. He's like, that's just politics. They just play at a higher level in terms of life and death, because that's what they do there. They don't live in a stable place. If you went around killing your adversary politically here, for the most part, that would be pretty bad. I mean, maybe you get away with it once, but you couldn't do it as a practice. Out there, you can do it as a practice. If you get out of line, it's tribal. They take you out of the line altogether.
Well, I'm not alleging this. I wouldn't be surprised to find that, say, Hillary Clinton had several people killed, in all honesty. I wouldn't be that shocked to find Donald Trump was tied into some of the older NY mob organizations. I do think in the USA there are more paper gangsters and stuff like that is rarer. One of the weirder experiences I've had, though, I was talking about murder rates across races once with a friend of mine. He said, well, you guys in the Black community have a higher murder rate. And I said, yeah, but you're assuming that there are no mob hits, serial killings, etc., that aren't reflected in the murder rate. So we made this bet where I would look at the unexplained disappearances in each city. And at the time, I half jokingly said, I bet hundreds every year of like Southern and Eastern European men will disappear. And it actually turned out, especially if you throw in Hispanic men, that's pretty much correct. I mean, I would assume that especially as you get into dubiously legal business, drug trade, and so, there would be a large number of Americans that have a political life pretty similar to a large number of people in Iraq. But, definitely, if you're a congressman, generally, someone's not going to come kill you. Although looking at, the Clinton and Trump stuff, there was that Enron guy who shot himself twice in the back of the head. So that did happen.
I mean, I think if you've got people that are going to beatify whoever their political leader is and drink the water and get fully in, you can get someone to do almost anything, especially if they're desperate. You get that standard Michael Douglas falling down guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, hey, on your way out of life, why don't you just do this and this? That'll help us out and exact some revenge for us. That guy exists. He just does. And if you've got enough influence, I'm not saying anything about the Clintons. I'm not saying anything. I mean, Roger Clinton's a good friend of mine, but yeah, I mean, that stuff happens. The thing is in Iraq, it happens at a level that's much higher. Hey, today we're going to have 5 synchronized car bombings because we don't want a certain thing to happen. And people go, we're not going to do that thing because there isn't a cop that's going to come help them out.
Yeah.
There's nobody. It's just, you have to stand in line, and they didn't know the line moved. And so they all move with the line to wherever it is. Because again, if you're out of line, they take you out of the line forever.
So one thing I'm getting from this, and this is, I think, an interesting, almost final point. The difference between what we think of as modern societies and what we think of as medieval or primitive societies is to some extent a veneer of civilization. So modern humans are just as potentially violent, just as sexual, at least, as people anywhere else. But we've built up institutions that help regulate these things and help provide basic services. So in the USA, we expect everything from paved roads to mental health treatment to electric lights to exist. And much the same for the French and the Germans and the Japanese. For that matter, the Saudi Arabs, most of our rough equal friends and rivals. That is what the standard is. In LDC world countries, those things don't exist. Just as they didn't exist in Mississippi or Greece 60 years ago. The road to your aunt's village is a goat path up through the hills, and to get there, you have to ride on a donkey. And to bring that entire area up to the U.S. level of development, you would need to provide lights for everyone and a roadway between the two towns and so on. Now, I guess the point that I'm making here is, to some extent, America probably could nation build if we did that. Like, if we wanted to treat these countries that we win wars with like one of the conquered Confederate states, if we wanted to go in and build schoolhouses and build a full national electrical grid and put wells in every village to provide potable water and leave, say, a garrison of 50 armed American soldiers in every sizable town and so on down the line, probably twice that many, so they would be cut off and destroyed, we could make those countries. I think all humans have pretty much the same potential at the group level, obviously not the individual level, but we could make Congo or Afghanistan like at least a badly troubled American state within, say, 120 years. The question is, are we ever going to do that? And my comment would be, if we're not, it might be a good idea not to nation build at all, just to shoot off a few bombs to prop up the king who's currently in power. What's your take on that?
I think, again, we get back to this state versus nation building thing, and what we're talking about doing. Yeah. Are we trying to create something that can create governance, and it's a government that people accept? Then, okay, I think maybe on a small scale you could do that. It would take a package of things. Just using your example, if you were to have 2 Greek villages, what happens in between those villages? I mean, you can have a checkpoint on the road, and if someone with enough influence in Iraq, they called it Wasta, and they're like, hey, leave me the hell alone. All these little girls in the back of my car, none of your damned business if you want to be alive. And then the guy's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Did you ever come by? I don't even know what and the guy drives right by. Or when the American goes by and he's like, hey, I'm going to go to village B, in between village A and B is their checkpoint. And at that point, you have to go check in with the man. And if they don't check in with the man, you have a real problem. And the next time you come back, you get killed or blown up, because these things are never as simple as we want them to be. There's power and there's money checking the entire thing. And so when we come in and think that we can provide these simple things, like, yeah, we'll just set a checkpoint up on this road and put these Iraqi soldiers out there, I can go talk to those guys. This is one of the things I love to do. Go talk to those guys and be like, how many people do you think you're going to stop today and give a citation to? Not a single person. How come? I don't know who anybody is. I know the locals, I'll let them in and everything, but anybody else, I'm not risking it, because if that person's important, I'll lose my pay for the month. You think your captain would take your pay? Oh yeah. In a second. Happens all the time. And so there's no trust vertically in the organization. And so there's no trust horizontally. And all of a sudden there is no police. it's a performance of the police. And so these guys just wave everybody by, and that's it. That's all there is.
That's a good way of putting it. Sorry, not at all to interrupt there. And you're more experienced in this field than I am, but anyone who's done any kind of A, extensive traveling, or B, even on the academic side, research about the rest of the world. That's an excellent analogy that you just used. It's not like they're police. It's like they're playing police.
Yeah.
It's like my boys that got married when they were like 18 or 19, many of whom were military, were kind of playing house. Like only like 3 of them are still with their wives.
Right.
And I'm not going to name people or anything, but like they like sex a lot with this particular fun girl. And they like, you get paid okay as, private plus a couple promotions, or, you're working on a sales floor. So you have a house, you don't own it. You're making the first pre-bubble mortgage payments, but like you'll make pancakes in the morning, and then you realize they're all these things. Like you're not using birth control anymore. You might wind up with 3 kids. Like this is real. The mortgage is about to bubble. You owe $800 a month. And then you can either stand up and go through to the reality, or the fiction's going to collapse. And in the LDC world, you see that an awful lot, as you know. I mean, it's not really like there's a functioning customs service, but there's a guy with the Gucci sunglasses on in a hut at the border on every road that comes in. Yep. Are you just paying him, or is that money going to the national government? Well, it doesn't matter. Yeah. It kind of looks like a country. The question is, what happens when kind of the rubber hits the road? Like no one has ever said that Middle Easterners, Arabs and such, are bad fighting men. But in Iraq, I mean, we ended up conquering the country in 6 weeks. Is that because they don't know how to fight? Like they're not capable marksmen or fist fighters? They won't defend themselves? No. It's because they didn't have any loyalty to the government. The front line was made up of conscriptees. Yeah. And when they saw, I assume, like the U.S. Black Horse with Marines sitting on the tanks coming toward them, they were just like, to hell with this. I mean, we might kill 2 for every 3 we lost, but why would we? They just surrendered. So I mean, it's the image of an army. It's the image of a police force. I think that's really a good analogy, and that's why a certain kind of woke leftist, especially. I mean, I'm kind of picking on my own bugaboo here, but a lot of people that will go to these countries will say, "How can you say these racist things about this perfectly functional government? We went to a beautiful, nice hotel, and there were uniformed police on the street corners." Yeah, but that's all kind of a facade. Like the cops don't arrest anybody all day. And, the owner of the hotel made his fortune smuggling opium and so on. And it's not the same thing as our society. Like that, even the hotel, the energy comes from a generator in the basement most of the time. There is none of the functional grid that we've come to expect, but there often is its appearance. And that's very, very hard for the average person to tell from reality. I think that's a fascinating point about the third world. Yeah. So, and that actually leaves you with a problem. Like, one, if you tear down the facade, like when we beat the Iraqi government, what's still there? It can be nothing if the institutions have been destroyed enough, as they often were under communism. But most often, it's the same welter of chiefs and tribes that you've been describing. And you can work with that. The question is, do you work with that to go to the next level of a kingdom, essentially? Or do you work with that to try to, again, create utopia, which will often just mean the facade? I think the reality is a better idea.
But the utopian goal is often run by the academics that come up with the theory. Yeah. And the problem is that stuff starts to break down the moment you deploy anybody. First off, no training to make that utopia happen. No, like these things, if this, then this, if this, none of that is happening. And the other thing, and this will, you'll get this, the difference between urban and rural. And then I don't know what you would call it, not pastoral, but like the rugged rural, the distant rugged rural, where you're so far removed from any sort of capacity to do any kind of governance. And I'm saying governance in general, not government, because the government can't do it. You have no ability to control these people. So like it's like when it's like the Biden mandate, right? Okay, well, how are you going to deploy that in Wyoming where there are 1 million people and there are not enough cops? There's too much space. You're telling some rancher who there's no cop within 30 minutes of his house that he's going to have to abide by whatever. You can't enforce these things. And so you have this rural and further distance socially that, okay, great. You can make Kabul, a bad version of Mexico City, right? Mm-hmm. But if you go to Cabo and you drive 5 minutes away from Cabo and you get off of the tourist area, totally different place. And it's how are you going to deal with that? There's so many points of failure. It's hard to do reliably anything about it.
Yeah, I think it gets down to pragmatism. Like, you could certainly work with the person who became overlord in that country. The Lord Protector is a term I like, to do some things where it was possible that we would approve of. I mean, there's no reason that an Afghan government couldn't, say, integrate the capital cities' universities to women, with a tacit understanding that most of them were going to be practicing medicine far outside of Afghanistan. There's no reason you can't do that. It's just when that starts happening, you have to remember the unique local characteristics of the place. You can't think that you're in America too. And that's fine for tourists that go in, like even Liberia, the capital is nice. That's fine for tourists or people that want to make a point about how blacks or Eastern Europeans or whatever, in fact, live in wonderful utopian countries. So they check out the capital city and buy some knickknacks and they come home. But the soldier or the diplomat has to be aware that that's the Potemkin village. And beyond that, if you go, like even in Jamaica, like Jamaica's a nice country in a lot of ways, but like if you're in the city and you leave the tourist district, travel like 10 minutes outside, you're probably going to get stabbed. Like it's one of the highest murder rates in the world. That's actually a problem for most post-slavery black societies, just like suicide's a problem for white societies. It doesn't exist in Africa, but in the Caribbean, like you're damn sure if you go to the bar district and you have a pretty date and you're outside the tourist area, you're going to get some fights.
Yeah.
Someone might knife you. It's just you need to be aware of that as one of the adults that's running the place. It doesn't mean Jamaica's not a nice, functional, damn near first world country, but it does mean you're an idiot if you ignore that because of this illusion that's in your mind. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's that performative part of all of that, right? You go to Monterrey, Mexico, and you're in the hotel where you're a guest, and I mean a guest, not like a hotel guest. And then you leave and go walk around town. They'll be like, "Hey, don't do that. Don't go out there." No sane person is going to tell you to walk around. And the same thing goes true for like Northern Africa. You look at the size of Libya, Chad, Tunisia. These places are bigger than Texas, sometimes twice the size of Texas.
Oh, yeah.
If you want to find an urban area and go live in that, you might be all right. But if someone chooses to on that day come in and take your life from you, they'll be gone like a whisper into the desert. You're never going to know anything about it because there's just too much space. And you can't govern that much space. There's no postal service and that kind of thing where you have this perception of a government. It's just, can you survive this? And can you do anything about it if someone comes after you? And the answer in most places in the world is no. There's nothing you're going to do. You're going to be robbed. You're going to be kidnapped until someone bigger or badder chooses to spend a lot of resources to fix it.
Yeah, I think that's basically correct. And again, like without the USA obviously is a better place than most places. But I mean, to some extent, that's true even here. Yeah. I mean, like there are plenty of, whether you're talking about like Caucasian Appalachian hollers or like neighborhoods in, say, Baltimore, there are plenty of places in the USA where law has very little footprint and you're dealing with local big men. I don't think there's any place in the USA that's fallen down to the tribal level. I mean, even like the gangster disciples would be a chiefdom in wonk terms. But I mean, the probably the default state of man, it's not utopianism and it's not pure savagery either, hunting deer with a spear. It's kind of high stasis autocratic societies alternating with barbarism, sort of. I mean, I would assume that's what you see in a lot of places like Afghanistan. Like the good chief rules for 60 years and then dies. His son is weak. So there's a period of 20 years of bloody war, raiding back and forth, stealing, women and animals and so on. And then the chief takes power and everyone has to obey, but there is peace. I mean, that's kind of the human default once people get to working metal. Right. And societies that have gone beyond that are incredibly valuable and should be respected. Now, on that note, I mean, any final comments on the paper that I haven't covered? Anything you want to tell me or tell the audience?
No, and no one has to buy the book or anything. It's not necessarily a book that anybody needs to buy. I'll put the link.
What's the book called?
It's called it's The Challenge to NATO, Global Security in the Atlantic Alliance. And there's a lot of interesting papers. And it's funny, a little side note, one of the ladies there spoke on female engagement in conflict zones. And what she didn't realize is myself and Rich are probably the two most recent notable academic authors on that topic, and we totally disagree with what she had to say. So there's all kinds of disagreement and dissent in all these things. So just look, I think religion is an important thing to be able to have the ability to navigate. I'm not saying to exploit. I'm not saying anything negative, but to see it and realize how much it matters. That's the main thing I want to say with this paper. The same thing, if you're going to go improve the condition of farmers, females, whatever it is, understand that that's deliberate work. It's expensive, and you have to be on the ground to go do it. You can't do it from the palace. You can't do it from a castle. You can't write a paper about how you should do it, because it's going to be completely different once you get there. It's possible, but it takes a lot of training, a lot of time, a lot of sacrifice to get those things done.
Yeah, that's a good closing line. Yeah, I don't want to step on that. That's what's up. Listen to the people that know.
Stand by.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much for